The Gospel of Thomas was not lost by accident. It was hunted, burned, and buried because it contained a single sentence that made every emperor, every pope, and every throne on earth completely unnecessary. Because that sentence did not point toward a distant god, a sacred building, or a chosen priest. It pointed directly at you and said the kingdom was never above the clouds. It was always already inside you, waiting to be remembered. There is a document that should not exist. Not because it is fraudulent, not because it was invented by rebels or dreamers, but because everything that was built on top of it, every empire, every institution, every system of control that called itself holy, depended on it never being found. And for nearly 2,000 years, it was not found. It waited in the dark beneath Egyptian sand, sealed inside a clay jar, preserved not by intention, but by the dry indifference of the desert, as if the earth itself had decided that some things are too important to disappear completely. When it finally surfaced in the winter of 1945, near a cliffside in Upper Egypt outside the town of Nag Hammadi, the men who discovered it did not immediately understand what they were holding. They were farmers, not scholars. One of them later said his mother used some of the pages as kindling before anyone realized what had been found. And yet, even after partial destruction, even after centuries of burial, what remained was enough to reopen a question that powerful people had worked very hard to permanently close. The question was not about theology. It was not about history. It was about something far more dangerous than either of those things. It was about where the sacred actually lives, and whether any institution on earth has the right to stand between a human being and that place. The document was the Gospel of Thomas. And if you have never heard of it, that absence is not an accident. It is the result of a deliberate and sustained effort spanning centuries, an effort that involved burning libraries, exiling teachers, labeling wisdom as heresy, and reshaping the spiritual imagination of an entire civilization so thoroughly that most people today would not recognize the original teaching if they heard it. What you are about to encounter is not a comfortable history. It will not confirm what you were taught in school or in a house of worship. But if something in you has always sensed that the version of reality you were handed was incomplete, if some quiet part of you has always felt that the sacred cannot be owned, regulated, or licensed by any human authority, then what follows will feel less like new information and more like a memory you were never supposed to recover. The Gospel of Thomas opens without ceremony. There is no birth narrative, no genealogy, no dramatic prologue about the Word becoming flesh. It simply begins with a line that has unsettled every established religious authority that has ever read it. It says that these are the secret sayings of the living Jesus, and that whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Not whoever obeys the right doctrine, not whoever belongs to the right community, not whoever submits to the right authority, whoever finds the interpretation, whoever does the inner work of understanding, whoever looks deeply enough into these words to discover what they are actually pointing toward. That single distinction between external obedience and internal understanding is the reason this gospel had to be destroyed. Because if salvation comes through personal understanding rather than institutional membership, then the institution becomes irrelevant. If the divine is accessible directly, without mediation, without priesthood, without empire, then every structure built on the premise of being the exclusive gateway to heaven loses its entire foundation in a single breath. This was not a theological disagreement. This was an existential threat to power itself. To understand why the Gospel of Thomas was so dangerous, you have to understand the world into which early Christianity was born. The Roman Empire was not simply a political entity. It was a total system, a machine for organizing human beings through hierarchy, fear, and the monopolization of meaning. The emperors were not just rulers. They were, in the official Roman understanding, divine representatives. Their authority came from above. It was sacred. To question it was not just political rebellion. It was religious offense. And when Christianity began to spread through the Roman world, the question that immediately arose in the minds of Roman power was not theological. It was administrative. Can this new movement be absorbed into the existing structure of control? Can it be shaped into something that reinforces hierarchy rather than dissolving it? The answer, it turned out, was yes, but only if certain versions of the teaching were elevated and others were suppressed. The version that survived and became official doctrine was the version that required external authority. The version that taught that salvation came through the church, through the priest, through the sacraments administered by ordained men within a hierarchy blessed by Rome. The version that made God distant and the institution necessary. The version in which the ordinary human being is fundamentally broken, fallen, corrupted, and must rely on an external system of rescue. This version could be organized. It could be taxed. It could be used to justify emperors and silence dissent. It could be deployed as a tool of governance across continents and centuries. The Gospel of Thomas represented the other version. The version that could not be organized, taxed, or deployed. The version in which the divine is not distant but intimate, not above but within, not accessed through ceremony but through the kind of direct inner recognition that no institution can grant and no empire can revoke. The version in which the human being is not fundamentally broken but fundamentally luminous, carrying within itself a fragment of the original light that preceded the entire material world. This version was not merely inconvenient. It was structurally incompatible with empire, and so it had to go. The Council of Nicaea in the year 325, convened by the Emperor Constantine, was the moment when the selection became official. Constantine did not call that council because he was spiritually curious. He called it because he needed religious unity across his empire, and religious unity required a single authorized version of the teaching. What was decided in that council was not purely a matter of theology, it was a matter of political architecture. The texts that survived were the texts that supported centralized authority. The texts that were excluded, condemned, and order destroyed were the texts that located spiritual authority within the individual human being. The Gospel of Thomas was among those condemned. It was labeled as heretical. Its readers were labeled as dangerous. And for the next 16 centuries, it effectively ceased to exist in the public record of human spiritual history. But the people who chose to preserve it rather than destroy it understood something that the councils and emperors did not. They understood that truth does not obey administrative decisions. They understood that what is buried is not the same as what is gone. And so they wrapped these texts carefully, sealed them in a clay jar, and placed them in the earth near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif, in the Egyptian desert, where the dry climate would do what their own courage could not guarantee: keep the words alive until the world was ready to hear them again. What exactly does the Gospel of Thomas say that was so threatening? It contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, and unlike the narrative Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it contains no miracles, no crucifixion, no resurrection story, no apocalyptic prophecy. It is purely a collection of teachings, compressed, often paradoxical, frequently disorienting teachings that refuse to be summarized into doctrine because they are not designed to be believed. They are designed to be entered. They are designed to generate an inner movement in the person who encounters them, a kind of friction between the surface mind and something deeper that the surface mind cannot fully articulate. Saying number 3 is perhaps the most explosive of all. It states that if the people who lead you tell you that the kingdom is in the sky, then the birds of the sky will get there before you. If they tell you it is in the sea, then the fish will get there before you. But the kingdom is inside you and it is outside you. When you know yourselves, you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, you dwell in poverty, and you are that poverty. Read that slowly. The kingdom is inside you and outside you, not in a building, not after death, not conditional on institutional membership. Inside you and outside you simultaneously, accessible the moment you develop genuine self-knowledge. This is not a peripheral claim. This is the central teaching. And it is the precise reason why every authority that has ever claimed to be the exclusive gatekeeper between human beings and the divine had to ensure this text did not circulate. Because if the kingdom is already within you, then the priest is optional. If the divine is already present in your own awareness, then the cathedral is decorative. If salvation is a matter of knowing yourself rather than obeying an external code, then the emperor has no spiritual leverage over you whatsoever. The Gospel of Thomas does not argue against external religion. It does something far more radical. It simply renders external religion unnecessary by pointing to something more immediate, more direct, and more intimate than any institution can offer or threaten to withhold. Saying number 77 extends this even further. It says that Jesus is the light that is before all things. He is everything. From him, everything came forth, and to him, everything returns. Split a piece of wood, and he is there. Lift a stone, and you will find him there. The sacred is not concentrated in temples or reserved for designated holy days. It is woven into the fabric of ordinary existence. It is present in wood and stone and the daily textures of an unremarkable life. The mystics of many traditions across many centuries have said variations of the same thing. But the Gospel of Thomas says it with a directness and a simplicity that institutional religion could never safely accommodate. Because once you understand that the sacred is in the wood and the stone and the ordinary moment, the elaborate architecture of intermediary religion becomes a magnificent distraction from the only place the divine was ever actually located. Saying number 70 is perhaps the most psychologically precise of all. It says that if you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not have it, what you do not have within you will kill you. There is no softer way to read this. The gospel is saying that the thing inside you, the spark, the knowing, the inner light, is not a luxury or a bonus. It is the essential thing. Its expression is survival. Its suppression is a kind of death. Not dramatic physical death, but the slow diminishment of a life lived entirely on the surface of itself, responsive only to external cues, shaped entirely by systems and expectations that were designed by others for purposes that have nothing to do with your actual liberation. This is why the people who preserve the Gospel of Thomas risked what they risked. This is why communities of Gnostic practitioners scattered across the ancient Mediterranean world maintained these teachings in secret for generations, even as the official church hunted and destroyed everything associated with them. They were not preserving an interesting philosophical position. They were preserving a living understanding of what a human being actually is, not a broken creature in need of rescue, but a carrier of something luminous that no empire and no institution and no doctrine had placed there. Therefore, no empire and no institution and no doctrine could remove. The suppression of the Gospel of Thomas was not the end of the teaching. Teachings of this nature do not end. They go underground. They travel in the margins. They survive in the private notebooks of mystics, in the oral traditions of communities that learn to speak carefully, in the coded language of poets and artists who understood that the surface of a work can say one thing while its depth says another. You can trace the same essential insight through the Sufi tradition, through the Kabbalistic understanding of the divine spark within the human soul, through the inner Christianity of Meister Eckhart and the radical self-knowledge teachings of the Rhineland mystics, through the alchemical symbolism of the Renaissance, through every tradition that dared to suggest that the divine is not somewhere else, not accessible only through approved channels, but immediately and intimately present in the aware human being right now. The discovery at Nag Hammadi did not create this understanding. It recovered evidence that this understanding is ancient, that it was present in the earliest layers of what would become the Western spiritual tradition, and that it was not eliminated through any failure of its own. It was eliminated through force, through political decision, through the application of imperial power to the question of what human beings are allowed to believe about their own nature. That is a very different thing. A teaching that fails because it is wrong disappears for reasons internal to itself. A teaching that is destroyed because it threatens power disappears for reasons entirely external to itself. Reasons that have everything to do with who benefits from its absence and nothing to do with whether it is true. And here is where the Gospel of Thomas stops being ancient history and becomes something uncomfortably present, because the mechanism that destroyed it in the 4th century has not stopped operating. It has changed its forms, changed its languages, changed its institutions and technologies and cultural vocabularies, but the essential function remains the same. The function is this: keep human beings looking outward for what can only be found inward. Keep attention directed toward external authorities, external validations, external sources of meaning and worth and identity. Keep the inner life colonized by the demands of systems that benefit from your forgetting what you actually are. The archons of the ancient Gnostic imagination were not monsters. They were patterns. Patterns of attention, patterns of distraction, patterns of misdirection that keep consciousness perpetually chasing something it already carries. You see this pattern in every mechanism of modern life that teaches you to measure your worth by external metrics. Every system that says your value is determined by your output, your appearance, your productivity, your social standing, your compliance. Every structure that rewards performance and punishes interiority. Every platform engineered to scatter your attention across 1,000 surfaces so that it never settles long enough to touch the depth that the Gospel of Thomas is pointing toward. The technology is new. The function is ancient. And the Gospel of Thomas named it 2,000 years before the algorithm existed. What the Gospel offers is not an escape from the world. It does not ask you to withdraw, to renounce, to perform a spiritual identity that sets you apart from ordinary life. What it asks is something far simpler and far harder. It asks you to actually look at the nature of your own awareness, to notice what is present when the noise settles. Not because you force the noise to stop, but because you stop feeding it your undivided attention. To discover, in that noticing, something that was not built by your history, or your conditioning, or your wounds, or your ambitions. Something that was there before any of that accumulated. Something that the Gospel of Thomas, in its compressed and paradoxical way, insists has always been there. The light before all things, present in the wood and the stone, present in you, waiting not to be granted by any authority, but simply to be remembered. The Gospel of Thomas was buried because it was dangerous. It was dangerous because it was freely available to anyone with the courage to look inward, impossible to tax, impossible to license, impossible to revoke. What was buried in Egyptian sand for nearly 2,000 years was not a document. It was a mirror, and what it reflects has not changed. If you have felt at any point while listening to this that something in these words was familiar, not learned but remembered, then you already understand why they tried so hard to make sure you never heard them. The kingdom was never somewhere else. It never required permission. It was always already here, waiting inside the awareness you're using right now to receive these words. If something in this reflection stayed with you, if a single sentence landed somewhere deeper than the surface, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. There are layers beneath this one. There are teachings that were buried alongside the Gospel of Thomas. Voices that were silenced in the same purge, maps of inner reality that were condemned, not because they were wrong, but because they were liberating. Subscribe so that none of those explorations reach you too late. Leave a comment with the sentence that struck you most. Not for the algorithm, for the record, for the quiet confirmation that this kind of remembering is not happening in isolation. You're not the only one who senses that the surface version of reality is not the whole story. And you never were.